book you should read, Katy, is Plato and Platypus. You will enjoy this enormously. It's basically, it teaches philosophy and logic just via jokes, which is absolutely beautiful.
That sounds wonderful.
It's very much about causal inference. It is 10 a.m. respectively 4 p.m. Time in Paris, depending on where you are. I believe it's 11 p.m. on the Singapore campus. So we still have people signing up. Why don't we give them we have a high frequency of people signing up, so why don't we give them 30 more seconds before we get started?
Sounds great.
Wonderful. Alrighty, let's get going. Thank you so much for joining the webinar. Thank you so much for all the participants. I'm slightly intimidated. We already have more than 300 people here, more people joining. Katy, it's a great pleasure to have you. Small people talk about people, kind of other people talk about ideas. So I want to get very quickly to the ideas. But a short background, you got an engineering degree from Princeton University. You did your PhD at Harvard University, again, in part at the engineering department, if this is my right understanding, in part at the Harvard Business School with Mike Spacerman. Then you joined Wharton. You are now a full tenured chaired professor at the Wharton Business School. A few things I would like to point out that I find so remarkable about Katy, beyond her kind of classical kind of accomplishments. The one word I associate most with Katy is that she kind of crosses boundaries, and in particular boundaries that are typically not crossed. So let me just give you two basic examples of this. So Katy does something that very few people succeed in, that she speaks to practitioners very actively, but she also speaks to academia. So she's really like a star in both dimensions, okay? And it's not one of these cases where you used to be a research star and now you're kind of focusing on other areas, but you have 2 conditionally accepted papers at 2 of the leading journals, Management Science and Organization Science. You continue to be a scholar, you continue to be contributing. Your doctoral students praise you in a very similar way that you praise Max Spacerman in your book. So you continue to be a very active scholar. You have a podcast, which we might actually come to talk later about. We can link it in the show notes if you want to. But there is also not just this practitioner theory boundary, then there are also disciplinary boundaries. I pointed this out. You have actually degrees in engineering, but you are mostly now known for your work in psychology. But your work in psychology speaks very much to economists. It speaks to people in marketing. You're very actively picked up by people in the medical field or people who care about health. So this kind of work is really generally relevant. The last boundary I want to point out too, and this is something I like a lot about the book and your work more generally, it also crosses the individual and the organizational level. So in some ways, and we'll come to this book in a second, I have 3 editions of it. I have the Kindle edition, I have the hardbook edition, and I have the audiobook. The book really speaks to individuals, so you can read it almost like as a self-help book if you want to, where you say this is how I can change. But you can also read it fantastically as a management book. If you're a manager and you say look, I need to change my organization. I need my customers to change. I need to help my customers to change. I need to help my employees to change. So the book also crosses these kind of levels. The book is beautifully written. Lots of things to like about the book. We come to the kind of substantive content about the book in a minute. But what is really nice, Katy has done an enormous amount of research in her life. But the book is more than Katy's research. The book is really something which represents what's currently going on in the field. She commands a lot of evidence she has collected on her own, but also evidence by other scholars in the field. And that makes the book very rich. It's also beautifully written. It's simply a fun thing to read. We learn about the problems of banks. We learn about the problems of Google. We learn about the problems of military academies and so on. And we learn about how to be a better mentor and how to give better advice and so on. So it is just a fun read. Without further ado, Katy, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me. And that was maybe the nicest introduction I've ever heard. So anyway, I'm honored. It's a pleasure to be here, and I really appreciate the very kind words. They will keep me feeling good for at least a week until I get my next journal rejection.
Wonderful. Katy, what is the book about? In your words.
In my words, well, you did it better than I can. It's always better in someone else's words. But I wrote the book because I felt that we knew enough from the research literature about the science of change that it was time to put that knowledge into the hands of practitioners, that it was time to make sure that people who had goals they wanted to achieve or goals they wanted to see their organization achieve had all the best evidence at their fingertips, organized in a way that could really help them succeed. And you know, it's funny, people say that you shouldn't write a book unless you're itching to say something. You shouldn't just, do it because you think it'd be fun to have a book, or you're wondering if you like writing. It needs to be like a true itch. And it really had developed to that point where I felt like, oh, how can people not know these things? It's so important. So many people could benefit. And that's why I wrote it.
The one way of thinking about the book, I don't think about it that way, but one way to think about it is like, what are a bunch of hacks to get your life into a better shape, so to speak, right? So can you highlight a few hacks where you would say, like, you see, you're probably like one of the things you're best known for is temptation bundling. Maybe start with that, but I would be very excited to hear about other kind of insights where you would say, like, look, these are hacks, these are strategies you can pursue when you want to change.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, actually, first, let me just back up and say the big picture message that I want to convey beyond there's a lot of tools that can help you is a huge mistake lots of people make, is that they look for a hack like, oh, set audacious goals. That's the way that I'll achieve what I want to achieve. They look for that hack, and P.S., goal setting is great. But then they don't actually think carefully through what are the barriers that are going to stand in my way, and design a strategy based on the best science that will tackle those specific barriers. And that's a huge mistake. Rather than sort of just saying, oh, there's a grab bag of stuff science says works, I'll try some of it and see. You really actually need to think very carefully about what is the obstacle you are likely to face, or a set of obstacles, and then look to the science that can solve for those specific problems. And I see this mistake made by organizations and individuals constantly, and it's part of why I wanted to write the book. But let's talk a little bit about maybe what some of those mistakes are. And as you said, I know people will want actionable insights, so I'll get quickly to a couple of things that I think are widely applicable and useful. But some of the key barriers to change are things like just motivating yourself to get started, feeling like it's no fun to pursue your goals in the moment, and impulsivity therefore takes over. And even though you have this long-term vision and long-term achievements you're hoping for, because we overvalue instant gratification, we may not make progress on those. That leads, of course, to procrastination. And then another barrier that people tend to overlook or forget about is forgetting. If we often have things that are sort of on our to-do list, but they're not maybe the very top priority, but they're important for our long-term goals, and they just slide out of a short-term memory and we don't get around to them. And so that's actually a really important barrier that most people don't solve for. Confidence, you have to believe in yourself, believe that you can do it. That can be a barrier, as can laziness, which is just, the tendency to take the path of least resistance, and also relates to our habits, our fallbacks and our defaults. And then finally, and this sort of bridges, by the way, I'm talking only here about internal barriers, which is what I study. And of course, there's lots of external ones. The final one is conformity, which is, are the people around me supporting my goals and showing me that this is possible? So depending on which of those barriers resonates and feels relevant to you and what you're trying to achieve, then the best solutions will be different. But you mentioned temptation bundling. So let me just give a little teaser there, and I know we'll go into some more hacks and solutions. Temptation bundling is for people who are struggling to achieve their goals because they're not enjoying them in the moment. Whatever goal they're trying to pursue, it feels like a chore to do it, even though they know it's important to take action for the long run. So some examples of chores you might think of, things like exercise. This is a sort of classic, like, I know I should, but it's not that fun in the moment. It's good for me in the long run. Maybe even feel good by the end of the workout, but beginning is a bit painful. Household chores, cooking fresh meals for your family or yourself, spending time with a difficult mentee at work could be something you might struggle with, even though you know it's important in the long run. Even, just sitting down and grinding to study if you're a student, or to work on a big report if you're in an organization and you have a deadline and it's pretty far off. Getting started on that project can feel like a chore. So those are examples of chores that have important long-term results, but we might not pursue in the moment because it's not that instantly gratifying. So temptation bundling is a solution to that. And I'll tell you a very specific instance that I've used in my own life and that motivated some of this early work. I struggled to motivate myself to exercise after a long day of going to classes as a graduate student. And I came up with a hack that really helped. And I should also say my other challenge was when I came home from that long day, all I wanted to do was basically binge watch TV shows or curl up with a novel that would engage me. I wanted entertainment as opposed to the exercise that I knew was good for my mental health. So I created a rule. I only let myself enjoy those tempting pleasures when I was exercising. For me, I was an audiobook person at the time. So I would listen to audiobooks like Harry Potter and The Hunger Games while I was working out at the gym. Other people find it more useful to watch TV shows, which PS, I have evolved and now that's what I do. But that hack of sort of, okay, I'm going to have a rule. I only get to enjoy these temptations when I'm working out, completely changed the game for me. I started looking forward to workouts at the end of a long day because I'd find out what was happening to my favorite characters in the story I was engaged in, and the workouts flew by. I was totally engrossed in those stories instead of feeling the pain, and I didn't waste time at home on watching TV and reading books when I should have been doing work, because I'd gotten that fix in. And I actually have done research, as have others, looking at the power of temptation bundling. We've done multiple randomized controlled trials demonstrating that when we give people access to, for instance, tempting audiobooks, who have workout goals, and explain to them that they could use them in this way, it increases their exercise by up to 50% initially. And there's some decay and it depends on whether or not we actually hold those temptations so they can only access them at the gym, or if we just suggest that they try doing this themselves. It's also been shown to work for students, which I think is really interesting. There's a study I love by Ayelet Fishbach at the University of Chicago and Caitlin Woolley at Cornell showing that students can make more progress on their math worksheets when it's in an attempting environment. So, they're given snacks and music and markers to work with, which PS their teachers were very worried would distract them. Because it's fun, they persist longer on their math. So there's lots of different ways we can temptation bundle. You could think about, you only let yourself listen to your favorite podcast while you're doing household chores, or a really tempting restaurant whose not so healthy food you crave, and you only let yourself go when you are there with a difficult relative or a difficult mentee. There's lots of different pairings that can make what would feel like a chore normally more of a pleasure.
What I like so much about temptation bundling, it kind of speaks more broadly, I think, to the underlying attitude of the book, I think, is that you see, like, you point at some point very explicitly to make instant gratification your friend, so to speak. So you have to, it's not like, oh, you have to fight instant gratification. It's almost more, hey, be aware of it and leverage it on your behalf.
I love that description. I think that's right. I think most of the barriers that we face, once we recognize what they are, we can outsmart them. There are strategies from science that allow us to avoid forgetting. There are strategies from science that allow us to leverage our impulsivity and turn it into a tool rather than an obstacle. Similarly, habits. We often think about bad habits as barriers. We think about laziness as a barrier, right? The tendency to fall back on the easiest path. But if we set ourselves up so that the easiest path is actually aligned with our goals, if we intentionally create habits that are designed to help us achieve what we want to achieve. These are all ways that we can lean into the limitations of the human mind so that they become assets towards achievement instead of obstacles.
It felt in some points, you don't make this explicit, Katy, but I wonder what you think about this. So in some cases, it feels as if when one reads the book, as if I have to deal with two versions of myself. There is the instant gratification Henning, who is kind of really challenging kind of to deal with and is kind of out of control, okay? And then there's the kind of Henning who has certain kind of goals and is thoughtful and caring about myself and caring about the future. And so it feels a little bit as if like, so it almost like a principal agent problem, so to speak, right? Like, so there's the thoughtful caring Henning, and how can that person kind of make sure that the instant gratification responding Henning is kind of navigating this world in a thoughtful way? Is this like a way to think about it, Katy, that I'm aware of my own weaknesses, so to speak, and deal with those?
Yeah, absolutely. And the way you just described it as a principal agent problem is very similar to the way that economists often write about these challenges. So my favorite research on this is probably from the early 1980s. It's work by Richard Thaler, and it calls this a planner doer problem. So sometimes we're in planner mode where we're thinking about the future, we're contemplating what barriers we might fall prey to in achieving whatever it is we want to achieve. And when we're in planner mode, we recognize that our doer self, who will be out in the world, trying to convince themselves to actually go to the gym when the time comes and eat the right things and mentor and be productive and meditate as often as they plan to, right? The planner knows that those will be challenges for a variety of reasons. And so the planner tries to create a structure in the life of the doer that will make it more likely that the doer follows through. And so that is how economists often model this challenge, is it's as if it's a principal agent problem. You sometimes are in that cool, collected state of the planner, looking forward and understanding that in life, you will face temptations, you will forget things, there will be all sorts of trade-offs that you have to make, and you're trying to set yourself up in the future moments where those temptations arise and so on for success.
One thing I would like to do, and it's another way for me to kind of slice and dice the book, is not so much by, so the way you structure the book, right, is by the different kind of approaches I can take, so to speak, right, or the challenges one faces. Another way of thinking about the book are the kind of big societal problems you are kind of taking on in the book, right? And where you say like, look, this approach, which has been pioneered by people like Rich Taylor, Danny Kahneman, right? Is to think about the societal problem, as you just brought up Taylor. Say something about saving. Saving is a topic for a lot of us, where I know I need to have a pension. All right, my trust in government pension might be limited depending on where I am in the world. What are some? Yeah, I want to avoid the term hacks now. But what are approaches that science kind of points us to in how we can get our saving in order?
Yeah, well, so first of all, I should say Richard Thaler, Nobel laureate in 2017, one of the founding fathers of behavioral economics and one of my favorite co-authors and role models. An amazing author as well. I highly recommend his book Nudge to anyone who has somehow missed it. It's fantastic. It's sold millions of copies, as well as Misbehaving, which is sort of his history of the field of behavioral economics, which is the recognition that people have these limitations, essentially. And then
I believe, if I can interrupt you, I believe the first academic paper I ever read was by Richard Taylor, actually.
Oh, wonderful.
Yeah. So
I have to tell you that my first temptation bundle was I was reading The Winner's Curse, which is a more academic book by
Yeah.
Richard Thaler.
Yeah.
I eventually switched over to Harry Potter, but I did get through that whole book at the gym, and it was enough to motivate me to exercise. So he's an
Oh,
amazing
wonderful.
leader. Even when he's writing, what we usually think of as dry, which are academic articles, somehow there's humor and so much insight. Anyway, obviously a hero of both of ours. Okay, so on savings, which has been a major topic of his work and others, and a major win really for the field of behavioral economics. I would argue that part of the reason this field took off is because of some major success stories in recognizing the limitations of sort of optimal rational decision making in the context of trying to drive savings so that people would be well prepared for things like retirement. The biggest win by far is the finding that if we default people into saving when they come to a new employer in the United States. So to be really clear, that means, you show up, you have a new job, and on the first day of work, there's some paperwork normally that you fill out, right? Some HR forms. And there's a form that you can complete in order to make sure that a portion of every paycheck gets sent to what we call a 401k. It's a tax advantage savings vehicle that your employer can set up for you. You can check a box to opt in. That's the way it was traditionally done. But there was this discovery in a paper by Madrian and Shia in 2001 showing that when a Fortune 500 company made a little change to that HR paperwork, instead of having people check a box to opt in, they could check a box to opt out, meaning if they didn't do anything, money would just start flowing into the savings account out of every paycheck. Well, that led to more than a 30 percentage point increase in the number of people who are signing up for retirement savings because of a few things. One, basically laziness or inertia. People are like, well, I don't have to do anything. It'll happen magically. And when I don't have to lift a finger, we see big changes in outcomes, right? People love not having to lift a finger. Second, it feels like it's recommended when your employer is saying, hey, we're doing this for you, but you can opt out. It seems like it's implied that the employer is saying this is a good idea. We also infer that other people must be doing it. And finally, and this relates to Danny Kahneman, 2002 Nobel laureate, other sort of founder of our field, along with Amos Tversky. Danny Kahneman has shown with Amos Tversky that we're loss averse, meaning anything that feels like we're giving it up, we really dislike, much more so than we enjoy gaining new things. So losses loom larger than gains. And when we opt out of something, it feels like a loss, right? To give up the fact that you're going to put a portion of my savings in retirement, that feels like a loss. So for all of these reasons, when you suddenly default people into savings, it's very sticky. Defaults are useful everywhere, it turns out, whether it's, organ donation or changing your homepage so that you're not taken to Facebook or TikTok when you log into your computer, but instead the New York Times, if you want to change, your habits around screen time use. There are lots of ways you can use defaults in life, or by having a workout machine at home, as opposed to having to go to a gym. You're sort of changing the friction and making it easier. So we can use this in lots of places, but savings is where we've seen the biggest wins. And of course, there's some other ways that we can use defaults there too, like we can automatically increase how much people are saving. And there's a really wonderful paper by Shlomo Benartzi and Richard Thaler on auto escalation combined with enrollment that's very effective. And in fact, in the US, we have laws that actually make it tax advantaged for employers to use savings defaults because this work was so seminal and showed such strong benefits, and nonpartisan legislation was passed to make these changes.
One thing I enjoyed is the linkage between how you deal with economics, because on the one hand, or with the discipline of economics, because in some aspects you point out that it's a little bit limited, right? You kind of describe interactions you have in the classroom. So you have this beautiful case of a bank which offers a locked savings account. So you can put money in, but you're not allowed to take it out, right? And so from an economist standpoint, like a pure traditional economist, so to speak, this at first sight makes no sense, because you would say, like, look, I limit my options. So limiting my options can't make me better off, but I end up saving more. So on the one hand, you say, like, look, straight economic principles are not my friend, so to speak. You might need to limit yourself. But then in other points, you're also saying like, look, economists are your friend, right? So you have this case of a programmer called Nick, I believe, who wants to change and who takes all his savings, I think it's $14,000, and say, I give these to a charity I don't like if in case I don't accomplish this and this goal. Can you say something about the how I should think about classical kind of incentives and freedom, so to speak? Like, how is this my friend? How is this my foe? How to deal with this? It's a question about the book. It's probably a much more broader disciplinary questions for the field of psychology. Yeah, I wonder how you grapple with that.
Yeah, well, I think there's huge, first of all, to use an econ term, complementarities, meaning, peanut butter and jelly are better together, so they're complementary. There's huge complementarities between psychology and economics as a way to think about how do we achieve behavior change, right? I would never say we should only use psychological principles to achieve our goals. We should use both. But one of my favorite findings from the behavioral economics literature, meaning more informed by psychology in some sense than by traditional economic theories, is that we can incentivize ourselves in ways that are very counterintuitive to a traditional economist, but very effective. And this is a tool, it's called a commitment device. It's a tool that's designed to solve the problem of impulsivity. And essentially what it looks like is we're used to other people fining us, for instance, if we're at risk of giving into temptation, right? If you speed, you might get a ticket, and that's the state sort of trying to prevent you from giving into that temptation and doing something that's dangerous. Right. But what's counterintuitive is essentially to say, I will find myself if I speed, or if I take steps that are out of line with my goals. And yet, if we know that there's a disconnect between doing what's in our long-term best interest and what will feel good and instantly gratifying in the heat of the moment, then we may actually want to set up these kinds of constraints and incentives that penalize us for missteps. Again, going back, we talked a little bit about the idea of a planner and a doer. To the extent that you're trying to plan for your own success, and you know that in sort of doer mode, you may be tempted to do things that aren't aligned with your long-term goals, then you'd set this up. So the case you referenced is one of my very favorites. This is a study that was done in the Philippines with a bank called Green Bank, and they set up a new product, and I should say this was done by Dean Carlin of Northwestern, along with Nava Ashraf and Wesley Yin, two other terrific behavioral economists, and they teamed up with this bank, Green Bank, to create this new product. And the product worked so that if you put money into it, you wouldn't be allowed to withdraw your savings until a predetermined savings goal was reached that you had self-selected, or a predetermined savings date. And these accounts, they have the same interest rate as a standard savings account where you could take money in and out. So there's a big fear that no one would use these crazy accounts, right? Because why would you want a less liquid savings product? It is not giving you a benefit in terms of interest earned. It's only constraining you. You have less access to your money. And P.S., that means the bank has more reliable streams of cash. So it's good for the bank. It's bad for you. It seems like this is a crazy product. Who would take it up? Unless you think like a planner and recognize people may be very worried about giving into the temptation in the future to withdraw cash when, there's a new product they see that looks tempting, or a holiday coming up and they just want to celebrate, but they know it's not really good for them in the long run, but they may be impulsive and withdraw. Well, maybe they'll want this kind of product in order to constrain themselves. And in this wonderful randomized controlled trial, some customers were given access to this new product alongside standard savings accounts where they wouldn't be able to take money out. And other people were only given standard accounts. And the question was, of all the people offered these two types of accounts, how did the savings compare? And year over year, there was actually an 80% higher savings rate among the customers who had access to this commitment account. And so it's just this incredible success. Similarly, one of my other favorite studies, also led by Dean Carlin in this case, who has done a lot of fantastic work on commitment devices, they tried helping smokers quit. And they randomly assigned smokers to either just get the standard tools for quitting, smoking cessation tools, or those standard tools plus an invitation to put cash in an account that they would not be able to withdraw if they failed a urine test in 6 months for nicotine or cotinine, meaning if they were still smoking in 6 months. And what they found is that just giving people a way to put money into these accounts so that they knew they'd be fining themselves if they didn't quit increased smoking cessation by 30%. So these are really powerful tools, but they're very counterintuitive. And a lot of people don't quite feel comfortable adopting them. In fact, these results are all obtained even with pretty low adoption rates. And that, I think, is even more remarkable. It suggests that if everyone were raising their hand and trying to find themselves if they wanted to quit smoking, you could see much more than a 30% boost in smoking cessation from providing these kinds of tools.
Katy, I found you've just alluded kind of to the effect sizes, right? How much has saving increased and so on. And very often how big the effect, like more broadly speaking, by the way, it's very nice how you bring the scientific evidence into the book. So it's not just, so one learns about science, but in a very, very kind of practical way. How big these effects are of sometimes rather minor interventions is very remarkable. At the same time, what I liked most about the book, or like one statistic you refer to is your take on it. So you must get called, or you actually point out that you always get called by journalists at the beginning of the new year, and that 80% of New Year's resolution fail. And in many ways, this is typically kind of taken as an indicator of like, oh my God, New Year's resolution are pointless. And you have a very different take on it. You actually point out, isn't that amazing? 20% of people who actually wanted to have like something new actually succeed in doing this. So I would love you to talk a little bit about how to think about like effect sizes in this context, not in the way scientists talk about effect sizes, but in terms of like, what's the practical impact of an effect size?
Yeah, no, that's a wonderful question. And indeed, I am a big fan of New Year's resolutions and fresh starts more generally, right? Every Monday, it seems to motivate people to change their behavior every start of a new month. We've got one coming up in 2 days, and birthdays, and we've done a bunch of research on this that we can talk about if you want. But in general, achieving goals is really hard. It's really hard to get all the things we want done in life. And I think, skeptics will look at high failure rates on something like New Year's resolutions and say, well, this means they're garbage. But another way of recognizing what's going on is saying, well, there's 0% of February 17th resolutions because no one's setting them, right, that are succeeding. Essentially, if you have no goal pursuit, then you have no successes. And what we'd like to see, given that we all have arenas where we'd like to improve, is more goal setting is good, because that's how we begin our journeys. And then more use of these sort of scientific principles. And I'm very pleased when I see an 8%, a 10% boost in follow through from these tools that are largely free. It's very different if you think about something where there's a real cost to society, right? For instance, think about I'm going to just give a policy goal that probably we can all agree on, that it'd be great to see more people who start college finishing, right? It's an expensive investment. If you begin, that probably means you have the chops to conclude, and yet a huge number of people who take out loans and begin down this journey actually don't complete. So there's a lot of ways you could approach that. You could approach it by offering tax incentives for people who complete a degree. And that's very expensive. And PS, probably, something we would want to support, and that would be great. But we could also layer on top use of psychological principles, and that's really the focus of this book, thinking about some of these psychological barriers that might prevent student success, things like a lack of a sense of belonging and community. And to tackle those is often almost free, or to reduce frictions in the process of completing paperwork to get student loan assistance. Again, changing things like this can be practically free. And so even if you see a smaller benefit, say, it's still a larger benefit in the sense of cost effectiveness. And that's often the case with a lot of the tools that I write about in my book and study, is that you would never want to have a world where we weren't creating a suite of ways to try to encourage college completion, say, or reduce emissions. You would never want to just say, oh, let's only have psychological interventions. And yet adding on psychological interventions is very low cost, even when we see only, say, a 10% bump in college student persistence as a result of that intervention. So I'm a big fan of using, we call them nudges. And again, we already sort of bowed down to Richard Thaler earlier. Let's just bow down again as the sort of father of nudging, and recognizing that there are these sort of almost zero cost tools we can use once we understand human decision making better to encourage things like college completion or healthier eating. They may not have the same magnitude effect always, although sometimes they're huge. We talked about savings and defaults, and PS, they stack up very, very well against things like an employer match, where I'm going to give you an extra dollar for every dollar you save up to some amount. You actually see really big benefits, but a lot of the times the tools will be a smaller benefit, but very cost effective.
Katy, we've talked a lot about what one can do by oneself, so to speak. I wonder if we could talk a little bit about the role of social context. You very, very prominently feature the work by Scott Corral on like military academies, on like how I'm not sure what the right name is, cadets or soldiers with whom I am in the same group, have a big influence on me. I wonder if you could speak a little bit about those kind of peer effects, but to a certain degree with an agentic perspective, like how I can leverage them, right? Because I obviously want to understand them, but we also want to leverage them for ourselves. So maybe you can talk about peer effects and how we can leverage them.
Yeah, this is, there's so much wonderful research showing that we are dramatically influenced by the people who surround us. And I do tell the story of Scott Corral, who did this wonderful work at the Air Force Academy, just looking at the effect of being randomly assigned a roommate and what happens essentially to the other cadets, or the other cadets in your squadron. They're not necessarily literally your roommates, but they're the people who you're spending the most time around in your dormitory environment. So you can think of it as near roommates. Gotcha. And what he finds is that essentially, if you are randomly assigned roommates who have higher verbal SAT scores, so sort of higher performance prior to entering the Air Force Academy, more studious in some sense, you end up seeing that your grades are higher in school. And the way I like to think about the peer effect here is, imagine you end up with a roommate who likes to stay in on Thursday nights and study. You think that's probably a good thing to do. That's the normal thing to do. That I see that's working. And maybe you stay in on Thursday nights and study. But imagine you're assigned a roommate who goes out on Thursday nights and drinks heavily. You're going to have a really different reaction and think that's the normal thing to do. And so these norms, they shape our own behavior with major consequences in many contexts. And so if we want to think about how to be strategic with that, we actually can think about how do we shape the social networks that we create for ourselves to support our goals. So consider maybe you have a goal of learning a new language. Maybe you want to become a Spanish speaker, right? Finding a set of friends who have a similar goal and considering signing up for classes together might be the very best thing you could do in order to succeed, rather than thinking about pursuing this alone. And there's a lot of reasons that tandem goal pursuit is valuable. I actually got to be a part of a study run by Rachel Gershon at UC Berkeley and also with Cindy Kreider at WashU, where we looked at whether or not it was better for friends who both wanted to exercise to be either paid $1 every time they worked out, or to be paid $1 only if they both worked out. And a standard economic model would say, pay directly for what you want, pay people for workouts. But if you recognize the power of accountability and peer support, you might actually think that it would be better if people could only earn contingent on their friend showing up too. They'll feel guilty not showing up for their friend. They're going to enjoy their workouts more together, and they're going to support each other towards this goal and see what one another can accomplish. And that's exactly what we found. We actually found that paying people only if they went with someone else led to 35% more exercise. Again, contrary to sort of what economic theory would tell you. And it's a similar message there when we have, and PS, what people told us was they enjoyed their workouts more because it was fun to go with a friend and they felt accountable. So accountability is another piece of, peer groups and trying to pursue goals in tandem with others. We can create accountability, but we can also see if our peers are all pursuing this goal vigorously, and if they're a little further along, they can sort of show us the way. We have another study where this was led by Katy, who's a professor at the University of Alberta and a graduate of the Wharton PhD program. And in this study, what we did was we looked at whether or not just nudging people to try to follow someone else in their social network, try to go figure out what was working for them to pursue a goal would be effective. And the idea there is we may not be intentionally extracting all of the information there is from our peers about how to succeed, right? Maybe you are noticing your roommate is studying on Thursdays, but maybe you haven't been really intentional about noticing, and they're also making amazing note cards, and I could do that too. Yeah. And I could, quiz myself in the same way. So we may need a little nudge to be more deliberate, in fact, about copying our successful peers. So we tried this. We ran a randomized controlled trial where we either asked people to go out and collect information from peers who were succeeding at a goal they shared about how they were doing how they were doing well, or we just sort of delivered that same information to other people. And we found that feeding someone the same content that another person had gone and found in their peers was not as effective, or just getting people to plan, as going and tracking peer behavior yourself. And part of the reason that going out and finding this yourself seemed to be the best of all of the approaches you could imagine is that it led both to the gathering of insights that were useful, but also to peer support. Because in gathering those insights from your friend that you were going to attempt to copy, you sort of see how they're implementing them. You see that they're succeeding, and that additional peer support seems to make it the best approach. So I guess I'm undermining saying, don't just read my book. I hope it will be helpful to you. But even better, go find people who are using the tools in it and watch how they're adopting them, spend time with them so that they'll support you, and try to copy and emulate the way that they're succeeding, because our peers are in some ways our best coaches.
I really like this kind of, it almost feels like a certain coupling, like you see, like very often a lot of the parts of the book are about kind of how to deal with exceptions, right? How to deal with the weekday. And what I liked so much about the parts about like the social coupling, so to speak, like this term I'm making up, is it helps you to get through a bad day to a certain degree, right? You see, like if I don't have the self-discipline, maybe my peer has, and we can get through this together. Katy, I've already started kind of weaving in questions we gotten from the audience. I will in a minute kind of switch fully on that. I have two more questions here I would like to bring up, and then I'll go fully to the audience questions. The one is about advice seeking. This was my personal, I found this most exciting about the book. You point out the benefits, not just of getting advice, but of giving advice. Say a little bit more.
Yeah, thank you for highlighting that. This is work by Lauren Eskris-Winkler at the Kellogg School at Northwestern University. And she was doing dissertation work to try to figure out how could we help people achieve more. And she started interviewing people who were underperforming to try to see, what wasn't clicking, and ask them what they think would help. Talking to salespeople who weren't hitting their goals, students who weren't excelling, and so on. And in those interviews, she noticed something really fascinating, actually a number of fascinating things. One, she noticed that people who were struggling were filled with wisdom when they were prompted to introspect about what might improve their own performance. They actually had all sorts of insights. She also noticed that they loved being asked over and over again. They said to her, no one ever asks me my opinion. People are constantly offering me unsolicited advice because they know I'm struggling. And it's pretty demoralizing, but it feels so good to be asked for my own input on these challenges, because I really do, now that I've reflected, realize I have a lot to share. And Lauren started to wonder if maybe we sort of have the formula wrong for how we try to support people when they're struggling, if a knowledge gap isn't the key issue, right? So if somebody's struggling in calculus because they don't understand calculus, they need calculus instruction. But with so many of our goals, it's not a knowledge gap. Part of the barrier can be confidence. And she realized in those cases, putting people on a pedestal, having them mentor someone who's a little behind them and give advice might actually be better than constantly serving up unsolicited advice to them. Because if you put someone on that pedestal, if you ask someone, hey, what advice would you have for someone else who's, say, in sales and struggling and a little behind you and newer to this field, it forces someone who's not doing terribly well first to introspect what might work for me. Second, it boosts their confidence. They realize, I actually do have something to offer and I'm not such a loser. And there is an opportunity for me to use expertise I've developed to create value. Third, there's a seeing is believing effect, right? Once you start offering your advice, you're going to feel like a hypocrite if you don't take it. And also you're going to start believing this is really the path. So there's a whole lot of psychology built together when we put someone in a position of advice giver that actually supports them. And Lauren has done a number of different randomized controlled trials showing that when we give people the opportunity to offer advice to their peers on how to achieve a goal, it improves their own performance. I got to be involved in one of these we did with students, high school students in Florida at the beginning of their third term. And we invited some students to answer a series of questions. It took about 8 minutes in a computer lab, telling other students who were a little younger than they were how to study effectively and how to avoid distraction and so on. And another group didn't go through this exercise. And everybody in the whole project in the trial, was about 2,000 students, had told us at the beginning what was the class they most wanted to improve in. And we looked at their grades in that target class in that quarter when they'd done the activity of just offering advice or not, depending on which condition they'd be randomly assigned to. We saw that those randomly assigned to give advice significantly improved their grades in their target class and also in math over and above those who hadn't been given the opportunity to offer advice. Now, I want to highlight this is a small effect. We're talking about improving grades by 1 point on a 50 to 100 scale. So it's not like an 8-minute activity turns C students into valedictorians. And that's really important because I don't want to oversell it. But the fact that there's any benefit is pretty extraordinary. And a statistically significant rise is seen over and over again in these studies Lauren runs, where being in a position to give advice, it improves your confidence and your performance. So you might think about, where could you create, are there goals you're hoping to achieve where you could create something like an advice club, which is something I have in my own life, a group of people with those shared goals who agree to reach out when there's something they're struggling with. And what I've found in having an advice club is that not only, of course, you get social support, we know that works, right? So there's other people trying to achieve the same thing and you can cheer each other on and see what's working for other people. You get sort of free consulting from the other advisors, but also when you are soliciting advice, which PS is not discouraging, not only are you helping yourself, but you're helping others. Every time I give advice in my advice club, I'm solving a problem that I'm likely to encounter in the future and building my confidence. So when that challenge arises, I know exactly how I'll handle it. And giving advice to someone else, you have more confidence because of this empathy, or sort of there's not, you're not feeling emotional about this. We tend to be more clear-headed when we reflect on challenges facing others and facing ourselves. It's a psychological distancing phenomenon. So that would be my advice on how to harness the power of advice giving.
You see, I would have pointed to an additional mechanism. I think so. So I've done a lot of research on learning. And I think to say, can you give somebody advice? An important part of learning is simply to reflect, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like classical kind of reinforcement learning, you take an action, you see an outcome, you reflect on it. But people very often don't do that, right? You see, like it's not as if you go after every class you teach every morning, kind of, I'll take care of my kids. It's not as if I sit down and say like, this worked well this morning or this didn't work well or so. But advice seeking is actually something where I say like, oh, you know what? I actually start reflecting. So I agree with everything you say. I think an additional mechanism of the advice kind of giving is that it forces me more into kind of reflection and more into learning.
I
One
love
fi-
that. And I
one
think it
final
was
question.
Seneca who said, and when we teach, we learn.
Yeah, very, very much so. Very much so. And so, um, Katie, as I read your book, I felt like, oh my God, I'm into all of these messes that you describe. Okay, so I really need it. But then I kept on thinking, why am I in that mess? And then I felt like, you know what? I am obviously to blame. Okay. But I also felt I'm facing a little bit of an unfair fight here because I read your book to kind of help to change, but obviously executives at all kinds of social media companies, at all kind of firms who sell like unhealthy cereal, unhealthy candy, also say, look, this is how we can manipulate Henning. So I feel I got put into this mess. Right? You see, like the I we are probably living in an environment today which has more opportunities for instant gratification or tries to manipulate us with instant gratification. Um, than ever before. So to a certain degree, I feel like you're helping me here a little bit to fight back, but I wish I wouldn't have to fight in the first place. Um, I wonder, Katie, if you can say something about this kind of about this tension, right? You see, like I need to leverage instant gratification, but part of why this is so important is the other side, right? That other people, other companies, whoever, that I'm getting constantly manipulated in that sense. So can you say something about that? I'm very curious about it. It's not part of the book, but I believe it's like an important part of it. Yeah.
Yeah, no, I think it's a really important point, from fast food, which is very, makes it even easier to give in to your desire for instant gratification in the domain of eating, to, scrolling through TikTok or Instagram for those sort of instant gratification hits that do not serve your long-term goals of, say, great mental health and also achieving productivity at work because you're
Yeah.
distracted. You're right. We're bombarded with organizations that understand how to push these buttons and how to accentuate our biases. I think, you could think about regulating some of these things, and there's certainly real efforts that are being made, particularly for young people, to regulate some of these temptations. And P.S. also, we have rules about alcohol and smoking because those are other temptations, and we have regulated those markets to try to reduce, at least for young people, the degree to which they are facing those temptations at important moments in their life when they need to have other areas of focus. So you could think about regulation, but again, that's not my area of expertise. And I think the best answer I can offer is, I think by learning more, we can better achieve our goals. And also we can be selective about what we expose ourselves to. And, you may choose that once you learn about all of these tools, you might want to download something like the Freedom app and actually restrict your access to things that aren't so great for you so that they can't get at you. You may also really get excited about some of the organizations that are using the same insights to help, whether it's Duolingo that has gamified and sort of figured out how to make it almost addictive to learn a new language, or an organization like Noom that's trying to build on the science of behavior change to help us with our eating habits. And in HR, there are similar organizations like Ahumu that's trying to use nudges to improve. So it may be that you also want to outsource and be selective about which organizations you allow to manipulate you. And you may pick that you actually like some of these services that are doing it for a shared goal, and that you want to be really deliberate about preventing yourself from getting sucked into the ones that are abusing it.
I like it. So in a certain way, how you've pointed out before, right? Again, understand instant gratification and then kind of leverage it on your behalf. A few questions from the audience. I've already kind of weaved a few in. The question we get early on is about a neurodivergent team member, for example, somebody who is subject to ADHD. Um, can you say something about this to kind of is the process different when people have like medical conditions? Is this like any thoughts on that?
It's a great question. I should have a good answer for it. This is not my area of expertise at all. So I think the number one thing I want to say is I think it's different, and that it is important to think about, learning from the experts on those specific conditions, what can be effective. But I hope that the same tools, to the extent that, some of these problems that I write about and how to change are the barriers in that case, I hope some of these tools may be useful. But the context in which these have been studied and the populations in which I'm reporting on studies are generally not populations with known neurodivergent characteristics. And so I just want to be very cautious there.
So Kana has a great question. How can you help teams and organizations see that change is needed, or work on changing when it's not seen as a priority, right? You see, like,
Yeah.
your book starts from the point like, hey, I need to change, but what happens if I don't see the need to change?
All right. Well, I'm pulling another book off my bookshelf, which I think answers this question. My favorite book on sort of how do we persuade people is a book called Influence: The Psychology of Persuasion by Robert Cialdini. I think it's literally my Bible that I go to when I think, I see something others don't see. I really want to make the most compelling pitch possible to change their opinion, to have them lean in, say, to an organizational shift. And then, then we can use the tools to help facilitate change. But first I have to persuade. And to the extent that persuasion is the challenge, then there's wonderful science on persuasion. And I think Cialdini's book is the best summary of that science. I'll just shout out to one tool, though, that's very related to something we talked about, which is one of the tools of persuasion is social norms, pointing to the majority of others are doing X, or the majority of other people think X, or even if the majority aren't, there's a trending norm. It used to be, that a small fraction, but we're seeing an uptick in how many people support this new policy. What Cialdini's work has shown is that when we see a majority of others leaning into something, or an uptick in the number, we project forward and we think, oh, that's the thing to do. If everybody else is doing it, I should be doing it too. It's part of what drives the power of surrounding yourself with others who are achieving goals. We follow the herd, but it also can be a tool of influence that's very effective.
Ryan followed up on the question about temptation bundling in a what I thought was a very thoughtful way. He asked the question, what is it if the core requires focus? So you see, you have the example of a workout where you can watch a TV show on the side. But what if I don't like X? What can I do?
Yeah, that's a great question. Okay, two answers to that. So some temptation bundlings don't require focus. So, or they don't take away from your focus. Like I like to tell students, a great way to ensure that you're going to study for your test is to only let yourself pick up your very favorite, say, tempting and sweet treat from Starbucks while you're heading to the library to hit the books. And then P.S. caffeine is a nice complement for studying, as long as you don't overdo it. So that's not a distraction to have a Frappuccino while you're working through your math problems. But many temptation bundles could be distracting. Like you can't binge watch TV shows while you're studying. And it may be that you can't find the right complementarities for your particular problem. It's not always true that we can create a temptation bundle. So another tool for solving that problem is one we've talked about a little bit, which is a commitment device. But I want to give you a very specific use of that tactic. And you alluded to this earlier, Henning, in talking about Nick Winter. You can literally put money on the line that you will forfeit if you fail to achieve a goal, as a way to change the imbalance and motivation between now and later. When there's a large enough fine awaiting you on the other end, if you don't turn in your report at the appointed time, for instance, it tends to increase your motivation in the moment to get that done. So if you know that your least favorite politician will be receiving a $100 donation from you if you don't finish X, that can be highly motivating. And it's sort of the carrot or the stick to get you through that procrastination and impulsivity problem. The carrot would be the temptation bundle. Make it more fun, make it more enjoyable in the moment. The stick is make it so highly penalized that you will actually get it done. And for some people, that penalty clause solution can be effective. And there are websites like BeMinder and Stick.com, which I have no affiliation with, I should say, or you can do this just with friends. You can create these kinds of commitment contracts so that there are fines set up to support your goals.
Johan asked a question about his 14-year-old daughter, and this might be on the mind of many parents. How can I influence her to have stronger discipline? You share in the book, that you yourself have a child, I believe. And so this may or may not have been on top of your mind. How can we use some of this advice kind of in how we kind of raise our children?
I think almost all of it applies, really. I mean, for one, I'll tell you that since my kid was young, when the TV goes on, the green vegetables come out, and that's my temptation bundle. I'm like, oh, you're refusing to eat well, then the TV goes off. That when he was very young, and I have the fantasy that he's going to be the guy that brings the Brussels sprouts to the Super Bowl parties, or if you're in Europe, maybe it'll be the World Cup parties. So that's my sort of temptation bundle there, but there's lots of tools. So I think encouraging kids to give advice when you see that they're struggling with something rather than just offering it can be really powerful. Can you put them in the position of coaching and mentoring a younger sibling or a neighbor when there's something where you'd like to see to help them along? I'd also say social norms are something you have a lot of control over. You can put your kids in the company of others who you think are peer groups that are likely to influence them positively. Be deliberate about that. Who are you inviting over and having them spend time with? And who are you pointing to? Can you say, hey, did you notice that 80% of the other, they may not respond to percentages, but did you notice how many of your peers all signed up for piano lessons this year? Don't you want to do that too? So I think there's a lot of ways that you can leverage these tools to try to support kids. And we haven't talked at all about inculcating a growth mindset, but that's another tool that I think is very helpful for children, is trying to remind them when they have setbacks that those setbacks can be learning opportunities, that every failure is a chance to learn and grow, as opposed to an indication of some fixed capacity you have for learning and success. So that can really, yeah, and I point you to Carol Dweck's wonderful book. Here, I'm going to pull another one off my shelf. Here's another wonderful book to read as a parent. Mindset, The Psychology of Success by Carol Dweck, who has done really wonderful work on growth mindsets.
Katy, we had the Swiss train policy as we started. We started on the minute. I am already like 1 minute over, which might make me lose my German passport if I'm not finishing on time. You know how impatient MBA students get. Thank you so much for being with us for an hour. This was simply fantastic. I will follow up with the participants and kind of share the link to the book. Maybe I'll do a LinkedIn post. Maybe Katy, you and I can coordinate that we can point people to some of the studies, some of the books you have kind of alluded to. That we do a LinkedIn post around that, so then people can follow up and read more carefully. Otherwise, I'm already planning the next set of webinars. I will share them again on LinkedIn as I've done in the past. If you don't do yet so, you can follow me on LinkedIn. There are, I believe, 400,000 thought leaders on LinkedIn, but just one Henning Pisunka. So you can simply follow me there. The next webinar is on March 15th. And we have Erin Meyer, who has a fantastic book on intercultural communication, The Culture Map. I will reach out to all of you. Katy, again, thank you so much. This was absolutely wonderful. I learned a lot from the book. I learned a lot from this conversation. Thank you so much for taking the time.
Thanks. I really enjoyed it. Thanks for having me.
Bye.